Once, he swore forever as he slid a ring on her finger. Once, she believed love was enough. But forever ended in a single night, one night with another woman, under the lights of a city that never sleeps. While he tasted betrayal, she carried his unborn child in silence, her heart breaking with every breath. Yet love's ashes can spark something more dangerous than hatred: resolve. And when she rose, pregnant, radiant, unbroken, the man who betrayed her would finally tremble. The courtroom was never meant to be a stage. Yet on that morning in Manhattan, it felt like the world's brightest spotlight had been switched on. The marble floors gleamed like polished ice, the mahogany benches were packed with reporters, and the air buzzed with whispers so sharp they could cut skin. Everyone was waiting for Jonathan Colton, the billionaire whose arrogance had always filled entire rooms. They waited to see his victory dance as he prepared to discard his wife like yesterday's newspaper. Jonathan had walked in with the swagger of a man who thought he'd owned the world. The suit he wore was custom Tom Ford, his cufflinks pure platinum, and his mistress sat just a few rows back, smirking in a crimson dress that clung to her body like sin itself. He had promised her that by the end of the hearing, his wife would be gone, his marriage dissolved, and she would step into the spotlight as the woman by his side. But fate had other plans. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and silence fell so heavy that even the judge froze mid-sentence. All heads turned, and there she was, Isabella Colton, heavily pregnant, radiant despite her suffering, walking slowly but firmly down the aisle. Her silk maternity dress hugged her figure, her eyes steady, her chin high. She was not alone. On her arm stood William Blackwell. The William Blackwell. The billionaire CEO, the man whose name carried the weight of empires, the one nobody dared to cross. He wasn't just a father, he was a fortress. And in that moment, Jonathan's smirk vanished as the color drained from his face. His mistress shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The photographers in the back nearly broke their cameras trying to capture the scene. Jonathan had spent the night in another woman's bed, laughing, drinking, feeling untouchable. But today, inside this courtroom, he was no longer the hunter. He was the prey. The whispers began like a storm gathering on the horizon. Is that her father? Oh my God, that's William Blackwell? She's pregnant. Look at her belly. He's done. Completely done. Jonathan tried to stand tall, but his hands betrayed him, clenching into fists, loosening, then clenching again. The judge cleared her throat, but even she could not hide the shock. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant, because this wasn't just a divorce hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. Isabella walked with slow, deliberate grace, as though each step echoed with years of betrayal and nights of silent tears. The woman Jonathan thought was weak, fragile, and broken was now a force he couldn't control. And beside her, William Blackwell radiated authority like a storm cloud about to break open. His icy blue eyes swept the room, and even the bailiffs seemed to stand straighter. Jonathan's mistress, Cassandra, bit her lip, suddenly realizing that her place in the billionaire's empire was not as secure as she once believed. She fiddled with her diamond bracelet, the one Jonathan had given her just last week, and wondered if it would mean anything once this trial was over. Jonathan swallowed hard. He wanted to sneer, to throw an insult, to reclaim control. But for the first time in his life, words failed him. The judge spoke again, her tone sharper now, pulling the courtroom back to order. "Mrs. Colton," she said, her voice calm but carrying authority, "you are here today to respond to the petition filed by your husband. Do you wish to proceed with your own counsel?" Isabella's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something far more dangerous. Resolve. She didn't look at Jonathan. She didn't even glance at Cassandra. Her gaze was fixed on the judge as she answered with a steady voice that carried to every corner of the room. "Yes, Your Honor. I do. And I have my father, William Blackwell, as my representative today." The collective gasp that followed rattled the chandeliers above. A billionaire wife backed by a billionaire father? The press would feast on this for weeks. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. He hadn't expected this. He thought Isabella would come alone, meek, trembling, ready to sign whatever papers he shoved in front of her. He thought she was still the girl who cried quietly into her pillow while he slipped out to late business meetings. He thought she was still the woman who begged him to come home, who clung to hope even when the perfume on his suits wasn't hers. But the woman standing before him now was different. Stronger. Unshakable. Unafraid. And the child she carried inside her belly made her untouchable. Jonathan glanced around, realizing the eyes of the world were no longer on him with admiration. They were on Isabella, and every lens, every pen, every whisper was rewriting the story. He was no longer the victorious billionaire. He was the betrayer, the coward, the man about to be crushed by the very woman he underestimated. And then Isabella turned her head, just slightly, her eyes finally locking with his. It was not anger in her gaze, not even sorrow. It was a promise that this battle had only begun, and that Jonathan Colton's empire, his pride, his mistress, his lies, everything would soon crumble before the world. And Jonathan realized, too late, that he had never truly known the woman he married. Long before the cameras flashed in court, Isabella Colton had been just a girl who dreamed of love, not headlines. To the world, she looked fragile, almost ordinary. But those who looked closer saw something else. An inner fire. A quiet dignity that no amount of betrayal could extinguish. At 28, Isabella carried both the glow of pregnancy and the shadows of pain. Her soft chestnut hair framed a face that had once been lit with laughter, but the last year had carved it into something more solemn, more hauntingly beautiful. She wasn't the type to chase luxury, though her life had been surrounded by it. She was the daughter of William Blackwell, one of the most feared CEOs in New York. But she had hidden that truth when she fell in love. She wanted to be seen as herself, not as a billionaire's daughter. And when she met Jonathan Colton, she thought she had found exactly that. Someone who saw her as Isabella, not as Blackwell's heiress. Isabella had studied interior design, a passion she carried since she was a child, sketching dream houses in the margins of her school notebooks. After college, she had taken a modest job at a boutique design studio in Manhattan. She didn't flaunt her connections, didn't drive luxury cars, didn't wear designer clothes unless they were gifts. She wanted normalcy, peace, a life she could call her own. Jonathan had swept into her world like a storm she couldn't resist. He was older, confident, ambitious, the kind of man who could make a room bend around his presence. At first, she thought his confidence was protection. He made her feel chosen, special, adored. Their whirlwind romance turned into marriage within a year, and Isabella believed she had found her happily ever after. For a while, it felt true. Jonathan spoiled her with flowers, whispered promises, and endless talk of the empire they would build together. He brushed her hair behind her ears at night, rubbed her feet when she was tired, kissed her forehead like she was the most precious thing in the world. Isabella told herself she was the luckiest woman alive. But love, built on illusions, never lasts. Slowly the cracks appeared. Jonathan became busier, hungrier for power, more restless. He stayed out late, dismissing her worries with sharp words. He traveled more, explaining it away as business. The perfume on his suits, the lipstick stains on his shirts, the hollow excuses, they all became shadows she tried desperately to ignore. When she found out she was pregnant, Isabella's heart had soared. She believed the baby would change everything, that Jonathan would come back to her, that love would win. She spent nights decorating the nursery, carefully painting the walls, folding tiny onesies into drawers, imagining the family they would become. But Jonathan only grew colder. The man who once brought her roses began mocking her for looking tired. The man who once held her hand in public stopped touching her altogether. And one night, she saw him, arm in arm with Cassandra Monroe, his mistress, at a gala he had promised was strictly business. Her world shattered. Isabella wept quietly that night, holding her belly, whispering apologies to the life growing inside her. She felt weak, discarded, invisible. But she wasn't alone, because her father, William Blackwell, had been watching from the shadows. Though estranged for years, he knew his daughter's pain, and the sight of his only child humiliated and betrayed lit a fury inside him. He was a man known for crushing rivals in boardrooms, for building empires out of stone and steel, but when it came to Isabella, he was a father first. When Isabella finally gathered the courage to confess everything, the lies, the mistress, the loneliness, William didn't hesitate. He didn't scold her for hiding her true background. He didn't tell her she was foolish for falling in love. He simply took her hands, looked her in the eye, and said, "You don't have to fight this alone anymore." For the first time in months, Isabella felt hope. Pregnancy had made her body heavy, but it also made her spirit strong. Every kick from the baby reminded her she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her child's future. And with her father by her side, she realized she had more power than Jonathan could ever imagine. The transformation began quietly. Isabella no longer cried into her pillow. She no longer begged Jonathan for attention. Instead, she began to plan. She documented every betrayal, saved every message, every photo. She leaned on her father's legal team, the most ruthless in Manhattan. She prepared herself for battle, not with screams or tears, but with calm, deliberate resolve. Still, at night, when she lay in bed, she remembered the girl she used to be. The girl who believed in fairy tales, who thought love could conquer anything. That girl was gone now. In her place stood a woman forged by betrayal, carrying life inside her, backed by an empire. And yet, despite everything, Isabella's heart had not turned to stone. She still loved. Not Jonathan. Not anymore. But she loved her child, fiercely, with a devotion that made her unstoppable. She loved the memory of her mother, who had once told her, "Strength doesn't always roar, Isabella. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it walks into a room quietly, and changes everything." She was ready to change everything. The day of the court hearing, Isabella rose early. She stood before the mirror, one hand on her swollen belly, the other brushing away the last tears she would ever shed for Jonathan Colton. She wore a pale blue dress that glowed against her skin, chosen not for fashion but for dignity. She wanted the world to see her as she was, a mother, a fighter, a woman who would not be silenced. When William Blackwell arrived to escort her, she felt a surge of courage she hadn't known she still had. His presence was not just protection, it was a declaration. The world would see that she was not abandoned, not weak, not broken. She walked into the courthouse not as Jonathan's wife, not as his discarded lover, but as Isabella Blackwell Colton. Daughter of power, mother of strength, woman of resilience. And when Jonathan saw her, flanked by the man he had underestimated, she knew in her heart that the tables had finally turned. Because the Isabella he had betrayed was gone. In her place was someone he could never defeat. And the war for her dignity was only beginning. The world Isabella had married into was dazzling on the surface, but beneath the glitter was a darkness she had never expected. It was a world of chandeliers and champagne, of penthouses with views that touched the sky, and of gala halls where power was traded like currency. To outsiders, it seemed like paradise. To Isabella, it had slowly become a cage. The Colton estate sat on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, a mansion that looked more like a palace than a home. White limestone walls stretched high above a row of sycamores, and the wrought iron gates gleamed under golden floodlights. Inside, everything screamed of wealth. The sweeping staircase of imported marble, the gallery walls lined with paintings Jonathan had collected at auctions, the dining room with a table long enough to seat 30. But wealth doesn't equal warmth. To Isabella, the grand halls felt cold. Every chandelier sparkled, but none of the light reached her heart. She remembered the early days when walking through those doors made her feel like she was stepping into a fairy tale. But as the months went on, that fairy tale crumbled. Jonathan's laughter echoed less in the halls. His footsteps grew distant. And when he did appear, it was often in a rush, barking phone calls into the air or brushing past her with a distracted kiss. The penthouse office was his true kingdom. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, the skyline stretching endlessly. It was there Jonathan met with investors, charmed board members, and planned the next deal that would expand his empire. It was also there that Isabella noticed the first signs of betrayal. Lipstick on glasses after late meetings, perfume lingering in the air, a second phone hidden in the drawer. But the setting that revealed the truth most brutally wasn't their home. It was the gala. The Bright Futures Charity Gala was the crown jewel of Manhattan's social calendar. Every year, hundreds of the city's most powerful figures gathered beneath crystal chandeliers at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. The ballroom glittered with sequins and diamonds, every guest dressed like royalty. Waiters in white gloves floated across the floor with trays of champagne, while a live orchestra filled the room with music as smooth as velvet. It was here, amid the dazzle of New York's elite, that Jonathan Colton decided to flaunt his mistress. Isabella had chosen not to attend that year. At 6 months pregnant, she felt uncomfortable in her own skin, and Jonathan had assured her, "It's just business, darling. Investors expect me to show up. Rest at home. You need it." She believed him. Or perhaps deep down, she wanted to believe him. But when the photos hit the tabloids the next morning, her world tilted. There he was, in a black tuxedo, his arm wrapped around Cassandra Monroe, the young woman whose presence had already haunted Isabella's nights. Cassandra wore a scarlet gown cut daringly low, her hand resting possessively on Jonathan's chest, as though she had already claimed him. The headline burned itself into Isabella's memory. "Billionaire Jonathan Colton stuns at gala with mysterious beauty. Where was his wife?" The betrayal wasn't whispered in shadows anymore. It was public, flaunted under chandeliers and camera flashes. Jonathan had chosen the gala, the very heart of their social circle, to humiliate her. And the world noticed. The Blackwells had always lived adjacent to this glittering world, but William Blackwell rarely indulged in such displays. To him, money wasn't for champagne and chandeliers, it was for building empires. But when he saw those photos, rage unlike any boardroom battle coursed through him. His daughter had been paraded as a ghost, her absence mocked, her dignity stripped in front of people who once shook her hand with respect. Meanwhile, Jonathan basked in the attention. The gala had been his stage, and he had relished every second. Cassandra laughed at his jokes, whispered in his ear, kissed his cheek while photographers clicked away. The investors had smirked, some amused, some scandalized, but Jonathan thought himself untouchable. He thought the empire he had built, the billions in his name, gave him the right to discard his pregnant wife like a forgotten accessory. But he hadn't counted on the storm that was building in the shadows. For Isabella, the humiliation cut deeper than anything before. She sat in her bedroom that night, the nursery half finished down the hall, staring at the glowing city skyline outside her window. She felt trapped, surrounded by a glittering world that wasn't hers, suffocated by chandeliers that now mocked her. She had loved Jonathan in that same ballroom once, at an earlier gala, when he had held her hand and whispered that she was the only woman in the room. And now that memory twisted like a knife. The main setting of their lives, the penthouse, the galas, the courtrooms, was a theater of power. It was designed to make people like Jonathan feel invincible. But Isabella knew something Jonathan didn't. She knew that even the grandest ballroom could become a battlefield. And she was no longer afraid of stepping into the light. The court hearing was scheduled at the New York Supreme Courthouse, an austere building with Corinthian columns and a history of drama older than Jonathan's fortune. The marble steps had seen kings of finance brought to their knees, had heard the echoes of scandals that once shook the city. And now it would host the downfall of Jonathan Colton. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse itself became the main stage. Reporters gathered on the steps, cameras flashing, microphones ready. The whispers of betrayal had reached every corner of Manhattan, and everyone wanted to witness the showdown. Was the wife truly broken? Would Jonathan walk free with his mistress at his side? Or would something else, something bigger, unfold? Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The high ceiling arched above like a cathedral, sunlight streaming through tall windows and casting dramatic shadows across the room. The wooden benches creaked as the city's elite settled in, ready to watch the drama of the year. Even the air smelled charged, of paper, leather, and nerves. And it was there, in that hallowed courtroom, that the contrast of worlds collided. Jonathan's arrogance against Isabella's quiet strength, his mistress's smirk against the steady hand of William Blackwell, the glamorous galas and penthouses against the raw truth of justice. This setting wasn't just the backdrop of their story. It was the battlefield where every chandelier, every marble pillar, every camera flash would bear witness to a war of betrayal and redemption. And when Isabella entered that courthouse with her father at her side, the glittering world that once mocked her became her stage of triumph. Because the same setting Jonathan had used to humiliate her would now be the place where he lost everything. Jonathan Colton was the kind of man who believed the world owed him everything. Born into nothing, he had clawed his way up the corporate ladder with charm, ruthlessness, and a smile that could mask daggers. By the age of 35, he had transformed himself into one of Manhattan's most talked-about billionaires. His name splashed across magazines that celebrated wealth as though it were royalty. To his investors, Jonathan was a visionary. To his employees, he was a tyrant. To Isabella, he had once been a husband, but in truth he was a man who could never be satisfied, not with success, not with power, not even with love. His mistress, Cassandra Monroe, was the perfect reflection of that hunger. At 26, she was everything Isabella wasn't, or at least that was how Jonathan framed it in his mind. Cassandra was bold where Isabella was gentle, loud where Isabella was quiet, unashamed where Isabella was modest. She thrived in the spotlight, feeding on attention like oxygen. To Jonathan, she wasn't just a lover. She was an accessory to his ego, a trophy that screamed to the world, "I can have whatever I want." The two had met at a corporate event almost a year earlier. Cassandra had been a marketing consultant hired for the gala, her striking red hair and daring laugh catching Jonathan's attention across the room. She wasn't shy, not the way Isabella had been when he first met her. Cassandra didn't blush or stumble over her words. She locked eyes with Jonathan as if she already owned him, as if she knew exactly how powerful her beauty could be. That night, Jonathan didn't go home to his wife. He went to Cassandra. At first, the affair was discreet: hidden dinners, stolen weekends, whispered phone calls while Isabella slept in the next room. But Jonathan's ego grew reckless. The secrecy became a thrill, and the thrill became arrogance. Soon, he wasn't just sneaking around, he was flaunting Cassandra. He brought her to business meetings disguised as an associate. He let her pick ties for him before public appearances. And eventually, he took her to the Bright Futures Gala, parading her under chandeliers while the cameras flashed. It wasn't love. It was power. Jonathan loved the way people looked at him when Cassandra was on his arm. The envy in their eyes, the whispers behind their hands, it was intoxicating. He had a pregnant wife at home, yes, but he also had a mistress who worshipped him in public. To him, it was the ultimate proof of his dominance. He could have it all. He could humiliate Isabella and still walk into any room like a king. Cassandra encouraged it. She fed his pride, whispered poison into his ear. "She looks weak without you," she once said after seeing Isabella in a tabloid photo. "You're the real star, Jonathan. You deserve someone who shines with you, not someone who hides in the shadows." Jonathan lapped it up. He began to see Isabella not as the woman he once loved, but as a burden. Quiet, unglamorous, pregnant, inconvenient. She was the weight dragging him down while Cassandra was the fire lifting him higher. But what Jonathan didn't realize was that his arrogance was turning him into a spectacle. The same people who smiled at him in public whispered in private. They noticed the way he touched Cassandra's back at dinners, the way his eyes lingered on her during meetings, the way his wife was conspicuously absent from every event. Manhattan's elite loved scandal, and Jonathan was feeding them a feast. Behind closed doors, Jonathan was even crueler. He mocked Isabella's maternity clothes, sneered at her for gaining weight, rolled his eyes when she asked him to be home for doctor's appointments. "You're emotional?" he would say dismissively. "Pregnancy makes women crazy." He didn't see her tears as pain, he saw them as weakness. And Cassandra was always there to reinforce the cruelty. She taunted Isabella indirectly through social media posts, cryptic captions, photos of her in Jonathan's penthouse office, subtle digs that only Isabella would recognize. To Cassandra, the affair wasn't just about love or lust, it was about victory. She wanted to replace Isabella, to erase her, to wear the title of Mrs. Colton as a badge of conquest. The villainy of Jonathan and Cassandra wasn't hidden in shadows, it was displayed like jewelry. They thrived in their arrogance, convinced that Isabella was powerless, that her silence meant surrender. Jonathan believed his billions could buy him freedom from consequences, that his name and influence could erase any scandal. Cassandra believed youth and beauty were enough to secure her throne at his side. But villains always forget one thing: arrogance blinds. Jonathan underestimated Isabella. He saw her quiet nature as fragility, not strength. He thought her tears meant she was broken, not that she was gathering herself for battle. He mistook her silence for surrender, never realizing it was strategy. And Cassandra, so smug in her stolen spotlight, never imagined that the woman she mocked would walk into a courtroom with a power far greater than Jonathan's billions. Jonathan's downfall began the night before the hearing, though he didn't know it. He had spent the evening with Cassandra at a penthouse suite downtown, indulging in champagne and laughter, boasting about how tomorrow would finally rid him of his wife. "She'll sign the papers without a fight," he bragged, kissing Cassandra's neck. "And then, nothing will stop us." But fate has a cruel sense of timing. As Jonathan slept off his indulgence, Isabella prepared her entrance with William Blackwell. She wasn't coming to sign away her dignity. She was coming to reclaim it. And Jonathan, the villain who thought himself untouchable, would soon stand in a courtroom stripped of his power, his mistress's smirk fading, his empire trembling. Because villains may win battles, but in the end they always write their own destruction. And Jonathan Colton was about to discover that the woman he betrayed was no victim. She was the storm he could never control. It began with whispers, but it didn't stay that way for long. Manhattan thrives on scandal, the way a body thrives on oxygen. And Jonathan Colton had given the city a scandal too delicious to ignore. The gala photographs had been only the beginning. Soon, the betrayal wasn't just a rumor tucked in society columns. It was the headlines splashed across glossy magazines and whispered through every cocktail party on the Upper East Side. Billionaire Jonathan Colton seen with red-haired beauty at gala, pregnant wife absent. That one headline had been enough to ignite the fire. But the photos that followed poured gasoline on the flames. Jonathan and Cassandra were spotted at restaurants, slipping into hotels, strolling hand-in-hand down Fifth Avenue as though they were invincible. The paparazzi lenses captured every smirk, every stolen kiss, every cruel reminder that Isabella, 6 months pregnant, was nowhere in sight. For Isabella, the betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was public property. She could no longer walk into a cafe without feeling eyes on her. She could no longer flip through a magazine without seeing Cassandra's smug face smiling back at her. Even the doorman at her building, once warm and polite, now looked at her with pity in his eyes. That was the worst part. Not the whispers of betrayal, not the humiliation of her husband's affair, but the pity. People looked at her as though she were fragile glass about to shatter. One afternoon, Isabella had ventured into a boutique on Madison Avenue, determined to buy herself a dress that would make her feel beautiful again, if only for a moment. As she slipped into a pale lavender gown, the sales associate's phone buzzed with a notification. She didn't mean to look, but the image on the screen was unmistakable. Jonathan, his hand on Cassandra's waist, leaving a downtown restaurant the night before. The caption read, "Love in the city. Jonathan Colton can't hide his passion for his new flame." Isabella froze in the mirror, the lavender gown hanging off her body like a cruel joke. She pressed her hands to her swollen belly, tears threatening to spill, and whispered, "I'm sorry, baby." She wasn't apologizing for Jonathan's betrayal. She was apologizing for believing, for hoping, for staying. But the humiliation reached its peak at the charity luncheon 2 weeks before the court hearing. Isabella hadn't planned to attend. It was a luncheon she and Jonathan had once co-hosted, a yearly tradition meant to raise funds for children's hospitals. But her father had insisted. "You cannot hide, Isabella. If you do, you let him write the story. Go. Hold your head high." She went. She wore a simple cream dress that skimmed over her belly, her hair pulled back in a low chignon. She walked into the ballroom on trembling legs, forcing herself to meet the gazes of the women who had once been her friends. Some smiled with sympathy. Others avoided her entirely, as though betrayal were contagious. And then Jonathan arrived. He strode into the luncheon as though he owned it, his arm firmly around Cassandra's waist. She glittered in a sapphire blue dress, her laughter echoing across the marble hall. The sight of them together was like a blade twisting inside Isabella's chest. She gripped her glass of water tighter, the condensation dripping down her fingers. The room buzzed with whispers. Some tried to pretend nothing was happening, that it was business as usual. But the stares followed Isabella everywhere she turned. She felt the heat rising in her face, the suffocating weight of humiliation pressing down. It was Cassandra who delivered the final blow. As Isabella made her way toward the exit, Cassandra deliberately stepped into her path. With a smile sharp enough to cut glass, she looked down at Isabella's belly, then back up into her eyes. "You look tired," she said sweetly, her voice loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "Pregnancy doesn't suit everyone, I guess?" The laughter that followed, soft, stifled, cruel, burned hotter than fire. Jonathan said nothing. He didn't even glance at Isabella. He simply tightened his arm around Cassandra and guided her past, his eyes fixed ahead as though his pregnant wife were invisible. In that moment, Isabella nearly broke. She stumbled into the hallway, her chest heaving, her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall. She wanted to scream, to collapse, to let the pain consume her. But then she felt it. The tiny flutter in her belly, the soft reminder of life growing inside her. Her baby. Her child. And she remembered her father's words. "You cannot hide. If you do, you let him write the story." That night, Isabella sat in the nursery, staring at the unfinished crib. She had painted one side of it a soft pastel blue, her brushstrokes trembling as she fought back sobs. But instead of giving in to despair, she made a choice. She picked up her phone, called her father, and said 3 words that changed everything. "I'm ready now." The next morning, William Blackwell's legal team descended like a storm. They gathered documents, financial records, photographs, everything they needed to build a case. Isabella handed over Jonathan's secret phone, every text message and photo she had quietly collected. She signed papers with steady hands, her belly pressing against the table, her eyes blazing with a strength she hadn't felt in months. The betrayal had humiliated her. It had cut her to pieces. But now, those pieces were being forged into armor. Word spread quickly that Isabella Blackwell Colton wasn't going to vanish quietly. Reporters caught wind of the legal team she had assembled. Whispers filled the social circles. "She's fighting back. She's bringing her father." Jonathan dismissed it at first. "She won't do anything," he sneered to Cassandra one evening, swirling a glass of whiskey. "She's too weak. She doesn't have the guts." Cassandra smirked and kissed his cheek, feeding his delusion. But Isabella knew the truth. She had guts, she had strength, and she had something Jonathan would never understand. A reason to fight that went beyond ego or wealth. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her child, for her dignity, for every woman who had ever been humiliated by the man who swore to love her. And when the court date arrived, Isabella was no longer the broken woman who had fled the luncheon in tears. She was the storm walking through the courthouse doors. The public betrayal had destroyed her once, but now it would destroy Jonathan Colton. Every strong woman has a moment when the weight of betrayal threatens to crush her. For Isabella, that moment came late one night, alone in the echoing halls of the Colton estate. The nursery door stood ajar, the soft pastel walls bathed in moonlight. Tiny clothes lay neatly folded in drawers, a stuffed rabbit perched on the rocking chair, waiting for a baby who deserved a family, not a battlefield. Isabella stood there, one hand on her swollen belly, the other gripping the doorframe for balance. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "I wanted this to be perfect. I wanted you to have love." Her child shifted inside her, a small flutter of life, reminding her that she wasn't alone. But in that moment, she felt more isolated than ever. Jonathan hadn't come home that night. He hadn't come home for many nights. His excuses had long since run dry, his lies as transparent as glass. She knew where he was, wrapped in Cassandra's arms, parading through Manhattan without shame. And yet the bed still felt too big, too cold, too empty without him. Isabella sank into the rocking chair, clutching the stuffed rabbit to her chest as though it were a lifeline. Her breaths came in short, painful gasps, sobs breaking free despite her desperate attempt to stay composed. "Why wasn't I enough?" she whispered into the quiet. "Why wasn't our family enough?" The truth she couldn't admit was that part of her still loved him. Part of her still longed for the man who once held her hand in the dark, who whispered promises of forever, who kissed her forehead as though she were the most precious thing in the world. That man had vanished, replaced by arrogance and cruelty, but her heart hadn't fully caught up. It clung stubbornly to the memory of love, even as reality bled her dry. In the days that followed, the collapse deepened. Isabella stopped leaving the house. The curtains remained drawn, Sunlight shut out as though she could hide from the world. Food lost its taste. Sleep became fitful, plagued by nightmares of Jonathan's laughter tangled with Cassandra's. Her father visited often, his presence steady, his words encouraging. But even William Blackwell, a man who had faced hostile boardrooms and toppled rivals without blinking, felt powerless against the sight of his daughter crumbling. One evening, he found her sitting on the nursery floor, the crib unassembled around her, screws and wooden slats scattered like the fragments of her life. She stared blankly at the pieces, tears streaking her face. "Dad," she whispered hoarsely, "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can raise this baby alone." William knelt beside her, his large hand covering hers. "You are not alone, Isabella. You have me. You have this family. You have more strength than you realize." But Isabella shook her head, her shoulders trembling. "He was supposed to love me. He was supposed to be here. And now all I feel is empty." The emptiness threatened to consume her. One night, unable to sleep, Isabella wandered into Jonathan's office. The room reeked of cigar smoke and ambition, the desk cluttered with documents and photos that meant nothing to her. She ran her fingers along the polished wood, remembering the nights she used to bring him dinner, waiting patiently while he finished phone calls, believing they were building a future together. On the corner of the desk lay a silver-framed photo, Jonathan and Isabella at their wedding. She looked so young, so radiant, her eyes shining with hope. He stood tall beside her, his arm around her waist, his smile confident. For a moment, Isabella's knees buckled. She picked up the frame, staring at the frozen image of a love that had turned to ash. With a cry that tore from the deepest part of her, she hurled the frame against the wall. Glass shattered, shards scattering across the hardwood floor like broken promises. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing into her hands, the sound echoing through the empty office. "How could you do this to me? To us?" The spiral was relentless. Even her body seemed to betray her. Nausea stronger, fatigue heavier, back pain gnawing at her every step. Pregnancy was supposed to be a time of joy, of anticipation. Instead, it became a reminder of her abandonment, a physical weight pressing down on her spirit. One evening, she collapsed on the bathroom floor, the cold tile against her cheek, tears soaking her hair. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, panic tightening her chest. She clutched her belly, terrified that her stress was harming the baby. "Please," she whispered through sobs. "Please hold on. I promise I'll be strong for you. Just hold on." It was her lowest point, the point where giving up felt like the only option. But sometimes, collapse is what clears the way for rebirth. As she lay there, trembling and broken, Isabella remembered her mother's voice, a memory so vivid it felt like a ghost in the room. "Strength doesn't always roar, Isabella. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's simply standing back up." She wiped her tears with shaking hands. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself off the cold floor. She stood, wobbling, but she stood. She looked in the mirror, her eyes red and swollen, her cheeks pale, but her reflection told a story she couldn't ignore. She wasn't just a betrayed wife. She wasn't just a victim. She was a mother. And mothers don't surrender. That realization became the first thread of hope weaving its way back into her soul. She picked up the scattered screws in the nursery the next morning. Piece by piece, she assembled the crib, her hands steady despite her exhaustion. Each turn of the screwdriver felt symbolic, a small act of defiance against despair. When the crib stood complete, she sat beside it, her belly rising and falling with each breath, and whispered, "We're going to be okay, I promise." Her father arrived later that day to find her standing taller, her eyes clearer. The collapse had not destroyed her, it had forged her. William saw it instantly. "That's my girl," he said softly, pride breaking through his usual sternness. Isabella wasn't healed overnight. She still cried some nights. She still ached when she saw Jonathan's face on a magazine cover. But the collapse had burned away the illusion of weakness. What remained was something stronger than steel. And Jonathan, in his arrogance, would never see it coming, because the woman he thought was broken beyond repair was now preparing to rise, and when she did, she would bring him to his knees. The collapse had nearly ended her. But it also gave birth to the storm she was about to become. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and anticipation. Jonathan sat at the front, shoulders back, jaw tight, wearing the mask of a man who thought victory was already his. Beside him, Cassandra smirked, her red lipstick gleaming under the fluorescent lights, as though this hearing were nothing more than a performance staged for her amusement. But what neither of them knew was that Isabella had come armed with more than dignity. She had come with fire. The twist began days before the hearing. In the privacy of her father's penthouse office, a room lined with bookshelves and portraits of Blackwell ancestors, Isabella laid out her plan. She wasn't just filing for divorce. She wasn't just demanding child support. She was preparing to dismantle Jonathan's empire brick by brick. Her father, William Blackwell, sat across the mahogany desk, his piercing blue eyes studying her with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "You know, once we start this, Isabella, there's no turning back. He won't forgive. He'll retaliate. Are you ready for that war?" Isabella's hand instinctively rested on her belly. She felt a kick, strong and steady, and lifted her chin. "I've been living in war already, Dad. I just didn't realize it. This time, I won't fight alone." William leaned back, a slow smile forming on his lips. "Good, because I've been waiting for you to say that." The first weapon in Isabella's arsenal was knowledge. She had collected months' worth of evidence, photos, text messages, receipts from hotels, proof of Jonathan's reckless spending on Cassandra. Every secret phone call, every late-night rendezvous, every extravagant gift purchased with marital assets, it was all neatly compiled into folders that William's legal team devoured like predators. The second weapon was power. Jonathan believed he was untouchable because of his wealth, but what he failed to consider was that William Blackwell's empire dwarfed his. William didn't flaunt it with galas and mistresses. He wielded it quietly, decisively, and with devastating precision. When the Blackwells entered a courtroom, they didn't just fight, they conquered. And the third weapon was a prenup. Jonathan had insisted on it before the marriage, smug in his belief that he was protecting himself from a gold digger. Isabella, blinded by love, had signed without hesitation. But what Jonathan never realized was that William Blackwell had reviewed the contract in silence, slipping in clauses so subtle Jonathan hadn't even noticed. Clauses that now gave Isabella the upper hand. On the morning of the hearing, Isabella walked into the courthouse flanked by her father and his legal team. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted her name, microphones jutted forward. For months, she had been invisible, erased by Jonathan's arrogance. But now, every eye was on her. She was no longer the victim. They saw it instantly. She was the storm. Jonathan's face drained of color the moment he saw William Blackwell. The older man's presence was like a thundercloud rolling into the room, heavy and unyielding. He didn't need to speak to command authority. His reputation spoke for him. And when he placed his hand protectively on Isabella's shoulder, Jonathan's composure cracked. The judge called the room to order, her gavel striking sharply. "Mr. and Mrs. Colton, we are here today to proceed with your divorce petition. Counsel, please state your appearances." Jonathan's attorney rose first, polished and confident. Richard Evans, representing Mr. Colton. Then William stood, not a lawyer, but a titan. "William Blackwell, representing my daughter Isabella." The collective gasp from the gallery was deafening. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jonathan's mistress shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering for the first time. The battle began with Jonathan's attorney attempting to paint Isabella as fragile, dependent, a woman who could not survive without Jonathan's fortune. "She lived in luxury because of my client," Evans declared. "She had everything she wanted, yet she chose to abandon him during the most crucial years of his business. We asked for a swift dissolution with limited compensation." But William was ready. He rose slowly, his voice calm but lethal. "Everything she wanted? My daughter wanted a husband who respected her. Instead, she got betrayal, abandonment, and public humiliation while carrying his child. And as for luxury, let us not forget, Jonathan Colton's so-called empire began with Blackwell funding. Without us, he would still be hustling deals out of a rented office." Jonathan flinched. Cassandra's nails dug into his arm. And then Isabella spoke. For the first time, she rose to her feet, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear, "this isn't just about divorce. This is about dignity. My husband did not simply betray me in private. He made a spectacle of it. He paraded his mistress while I carried his child. I have evidence to prove his misconduct, not just against me but against our marriage contract. She handed a folder to the bailiff. Inside were photos, texts, receipts, all the proof of Jonathan's arrogance. The judge flipped through the documents, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. "Those don't mean anything," he snapped. "Every man." "Every man?" William interrupted sharply. His voice cut like steel. "Every man doesn't abandon his pregnant wife to flaunt a mistress under chandeliers. Every man doesn't siphon marital assets to buy diamonds for another woman. Don't confuse your moral failure with manhood, Jonathan." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Jonathan's face flushed crimson. But the final twist came when William slid another document across the table. "The prenup," Jonathan sneered. "That protects me, not her." William's eyes gleamed coldly. "You should have read it more carefully. Section 14, paragraph 2. In the event of adultery, the faithful spouse retains controlling interest in all joint assets as well as custody rights. Signed by you, witnessed by 2 attorneys. The judge adjusted her glasses, scanning the clause. Her gavel struck once. "It's valid." Jonathan's mouth fell open. Cassandra paled. The press scribbled frantically. In that instant, the balance of power shifted entirely. Isabella, once humiliated, once pitied, now stood victorious. The evidence, the prenup, the presence of William Blackwell, it was all a carefully orchestrated symphony of justice. Jonathan slumped in his chair, his bravado collapsing under the weight of his own arrogance. Cassandra's smirk was gone, replaced with a mask of fear. The gallery buzzed, the whispers now celebratory, even awed. And Isabella? She sat tall, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes calm and resolute. She didn't gloat, she didn't sneer. She simply met Jonathan's gaze with the quiet strength of a woman who had been broken, rebuilt, and reborn. The twist was complete. The betrayed wife was no longer prey. She was the storm that had just begun to roar. The morning after the prenup revelation, New York woke up buzzing. Headlines screamed across every front page. Jonathan Colton blindsided in court, wife and Blackwell empire strike back. Pregnant heiress Isabella Blackwell stuns courtroom with power move. The story was everywhere. Isabella, who had been invisible for months, was suddenly the city's most talked about woman. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't being pitied. She was being respected. But transformation isn't only about public perception. It begins within. For weeks, Isabella had been a shadow of herself, hiding behind drawn curtains, drowning in humiliation. Now, as she stood before the mirror in her father's penthouse, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes were sharper, her shoulders straighter, her presence commanding in a way she had never imagined. Her stylist, a woman named Marissa, who had worked with celebrities and CEOs' wives, hovered behind her, adjusting the hem of a tailored black dress. "You don't need sequins or diamonds," Marissa murmured. "Your strength is the statement. Simple, elegant, unshakable." Isabella touched the fabric, feeling its weight. It wasn't about vanity, it was about armor. For months she had been ridiculed for her swollen belly, mocked for looking tired and weak. Now she embraced it. Her pregnancy wasn't a flaw, it was her power. She carried life while Jonathan carried shame. William entered the room, his gaze softening at the sight of his daughter. "You look like your mother," he said quietly. She had the same fire in her eyes when she walked into a room ready to prove herself. Isabella smiled faintly. "I don't feel like her. I feel different, stronger. Like everything that was broken in me had to break so something new could grow." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's not different, Isabella. That's exactly who you've always been. You just didn't know it yet." That afternoon, Isabella made her first public appearance since the court hearing. It was a fundraiser hosted at the Blackwell Group's headquarters, an event her father had once managed alone but now insisted she co-host. The sleek glass tower glittered against the Manhattan skyline, its lobby transformed into a stage for cameras, reporters, and the city's most powerful elite. When Isabella stepped out of the black car, the crowd hushed. Gone was the woman who once slipped quietly into rooms. She walked with her head high, her hand resting on her belly with pride, her black dress flowing elegantly around her. Flashbulbs erupted, but she didn't flinch. She welcomed them. A reporter shouted, "Mrs. Colton, do you have any words for your husband?" Isabella paused, her gaze steady. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying through the microphones. Every woman deserves respect. Every child deserves a home built on love, not betrayal. That's all I will say." The room erupted in applause. The headline was written in that very moment. Isabella Blackwell, the woman who turned betrayal into power. Inside, Isabella mingled with investors, philanthropists, and socialites who had once pitied her. Now they looked at her with admiration, even awe. She was no longer Jonathan's wife. She was Isabella Blackwell, heiress, mother, survivor, force of her own. But transformation isn't only external. Behind the elegant facade, Isabella's heart had shifted too. She no longer craved Jonathan's approval. She no longer replayed their happy memories with longing. Instead, she replayed the lessons his betrayal had taught her. She realized she had spent years silencing her own voice for the sake of love. Now she spoke with clarity, authority, and courage. Her confidence grew each day. She joined her father in board meetings, her sharp observations surprising even seasoned executives. She walked through the Blackwell Group's corridors, not as a visitor, but as a future leader. And slowly, she began to envision a life beyond heartbreak, not just surviving, but thriving. Jonathan, meanwhile, was unraveling. Every newspaper, every television channel, every social media platform carried the story of his downfall. Investors grew nervous. Partners withdrew. Cassandra, once proud to stand by his side, began to distance herself as the glitter faded. Jonathan had thought he was untouchable, but the city was watching him crumble, and it was Isabella's transformation that had lit the fuse. Still, Isabella wasn't finished. Her transformation was not about revenge. It was about liberation. She no longer wanted to prove herself to Jonathan. She wanted to prove herself to herself. One night, after a long day of meetings, Isabella stood on the balcony of her father's penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly before her. She pressed her hand to her belly and whispered, "We're going to be okay. You and me. We'll build a life filled with love, not lies. I promise." The baby kicked as if answering her. The transformation was complete. She wasn't just a wife betrayed. She wasn't just a daughter protected. She was a woman reborn, carrying life and strength in equal measure. And the city wasn't just watching anymore. It was cheering. Because Isabella Blackwell had gone from humiliation to triumph, from whispers of pity to headlines of power, from tears in a nursery to commanding rooms filled with the world's elite. Her makeover wasn't just in her dress or her hair. It was in her soul. She had been broken, yes, but in breaking, she had discovered the pieces of herself she had never known. And with those pieces, she built a new identity, stronger than anything Jonathan could ever destroy. The transformation was no longer just hers. It was an anthem for every woman who had ever been betrayed. And soon, Jonathan Colton would learn what it meant to face a woman who had risen from the ashes. The ballroom glittered like a jewel box. Chandeliers dripped crystal light, violins played softly in the background, and Manhattan's elite filled the air with chatter and champagne laughter. It was the annual Empire Business Awards Gala, a night meant to honor the city's most powerful, a night Jonathan Colton believed would restore his reputation. He had pulled every string he could to ensure his nomination for Entrepreneur of the Year. He needed the stage, the applause, the validation. After weeks of humiliation in the press, he saw this gala as his comeback. Cassandra clung to his arm, her sapphire gown daring, her smile sharp. Together, they walked into the room as though nothing had happened, as though the scandal hadn't reduced Jonathan's empire to ashes. But tonight, the stage belonged to someone else. When Isabella entered, the air shifted. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. She was radiant in an emerald gown that hugged her pregnant form like a crown jewel, her hair swept elegantly back, her presence commanding. At her side was William Blackwell, his imposing figure radiating silent power. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing furiously. The whispers flew across the room. She came. She actually came. Jonathan's smug smile faltered. His drink trembled in his hand. Cassandra's nails dug into his arm, her eyes darting nervously. The evening unfolded with its usual pomp, awards, speeches, applause. Jonathan sat stiffly, waiting for his moment, clinging to the illusion that this night would be his redemption. But as the presenter approached the podium, Isabella rose from her seat. "Excuse me," her voice rang out, calm yet commanding. The microphone caught it, and suddenly the entire ballroom fell silent. She walked gracefully to the stage, every eye following her. When she stood at the podium, the emerald fabric shimmering under the lights, she looked not like a broken wife, but like a queen reclaiming her throne. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady. "I hadn't planned to speak tonight, but I realized something as I sat here watching this celebration of success. Success is not measured in dollars. It is not measured in power or even applause. True success is measured in integrity. And integrity," she paused, her gaze locking onto Jonathan, "cannot be bought." A ripple went through the crowd. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched. Isabella continued, her words precise, deliberate. "Some of you know me as Isabella Colton, the wife who disappeared from these galas, the woman whispered about in tabloids. But I am not that woman anymore. I am Isabella Blackwell, daughter, mother, and a woman who refuses to be silenced." The room erupted in applause. Jonathan's face burned red. She lifted a folder from the podium. "In this folder," she said clearly, "is evidence of what happens when arrogance blinds men into believing they are untouchable. Affairs, fraud, assets siphoned from a marriage to fund a mistress's wardrobe. Documents signed with careless hands. For months I carried the shame of someone else's betrayal. Tonight, I return that shame to its rightful owner." Gasps filled the room. Cameras zoomed in. Cassandra paled, her painted smile cracking. Jonathan half rose from his chair, his voice breaking. "This is slander." "Sit down, Jonathan," William's voice thundered from the front row. The command silenced him instantly. Isabella's eyes never wavered. "This isn't slander. This is truth. And the truth is simple. You cannot build an empire on lies and expect it to stand. My husband forgot that. He believed wealth excused betrayal, that mistresses could replace vows, that humiliation could break me. He was wrong." The crowd erupted again, applause shaking the chandeliers. Some stood, clapping with admiration. Others leaned forward hungrily, thrilled by the spectacle. Cassandra, desperate, grabbed Jonathan's arm. "Do something," she hissed. But Jonathan was frozen, his mask of control shattered. Isabella wasn't finished. She leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dropping to a calm, devastating softness. "To every woman who has ever been betrayed, hear me. You are not weak. You are not invisible. Betrayal does not define you, it reveals them. And sometimes the best revenge is simply standing tall while they crumble at your feet." The words struck like a hammer. The room roared with applause, louder than anything Jonathan could have hoped for. Reporters scrambled, capturing every second. The story was no longer Jonathan's comeback. It was Isabella's victory. Jonathan rose to his feet, his voice trembling with rage. "You'll regret this, Isabella." But Isabella turned, her emerald gown sweeping behind her, and met his eyes one final time. "No, Jonathan, the only one who will regret anything is you." The spotlight followed her as she descended the stage, her father rising to meet her, pride blazing in his eyes. The cameras captured the moment, the image that would dominate headlines for weeks. Isabella Blackwell, pregnant and powerful, walking away from her husband's downfall with her head held high. Behind her, Jonathan slumped back into his chair, the weight of humiliation crushing him. Cassandra's hand slipped from his arm, her eyes darting to the exits. The empire he had tried to rebuild that night collapsed in a single speech, not with numbers or contracts, but with truth spoken by the woman he thought he had destroyed. The gala ended, but the echoes of Isabella's revenge lingered long after. Reporters ran her quotes across the globe. Women wrote letters of admiration. Investors once loyal to Jonathan fled to the Blackwells. And Jonathan, once the king of Manhattan, found himself dethroned by the very woman he had underestimated. Revenge didn't need poison or violence. It only needed a stage, the truth, and a woman strong enough to speak it. And Isabella had spoken it for the world to hear. That night, Jonathan Colton's empire died, but Isabella Blackwell's legend was born. The weeks after the gala unfolded like a storybook written by fate itself. For Jonathan Colton, the downfall was swift and merciless. His empire, once envied, began to crumble as investors withdrew and partners severed ties. The media, relentless in its hunger for scandal, devoured every detail of his collapse. Each day brought new headlines. Colton Industries in crisis, stock value plummets. Mistress Cassandra Monroe cuts ties amid scandal. Jonathan Colton faces investigation for financial misconduct. He had wanted the spotlight, but now it burned him alive. Cassandra, The woman he once paraded like a trophy vanished almost overnight. Rumors swirled that she had taken the last of Jonathan's gifts, diamonds, handbags, cash, and fled to Europe. Without her glittering presence, Jonathan looked smaller, weaker, like a king stripped of his crown. Meanwhile, Isabella's life was transforming in ways she had once thought impossible. The tabloids that had once mocked her now hailed her as a heroine. Women across the city sent her letters, some handwritten, some emails, some messages on social media. They thanked her for standing up, for proving that betrayal didn't have to end in silence. "You gave me courage to leave," one woman wrote. "Because of you, I believe I can start again." But Isabella wasn't seeking fame. She was building a new future, not just for herself, but for her child. With her father's support, she began taking on more responsibilities at the Blackwell Group. She wasn't just attending meetings now, she was leading them. Her calm yet firm voice carried weight. Her decisions impressed even the most seasoned executives. She had discovered a talent for strategy, for leadership, for commanding respect without demanding it. And slowly, she realized something profound. Jonathan's betrayal had not destroyed her life. It had redirected it. The nursery that had once been filled with tears and despair was now filled with hope. Isabella spent her evenings painting soft murals on the walls. Stars, clouds, gentle animals. She wanted her baby to wake each morning surrounded by beauty, by a reminder that life was still good, still full of love. Her father often joined her, assembling furniture or reading aloud from business reports as she painted. They laughed together, sometimes cried together, but through it all, they grew closer than ever. For William Blackwell, protecting his daughter had become his greatest achievement. And for Isabella, discovering her own strength had become her greatest gift. Jonathan tried to fight back, of course. He filed appeals, demanded settlements, attempted to salvage his name. But every effort fell flat. The prenup was ironclad. The evidence of his misconduct was overwhelming. The judge granted Isabella full custody, controlling interest in their joint assets, and freedom from the man who had caused her so much pain. On the day the divorce was finalized, Isabella walked out of the courthouse with her father at her side. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but she didn't stop to answer. She only smiled, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes shining with quiet triumph. "Isabella, do you have any final words for Jonathan?" One reporter called. She paused at the courthouse steps, her emerald coat fluttering in the winter breeze. She turned just enough for the cameras to capture her expression, calm, serene, unshakable. "Yes," she said softly. "I wish him well. May he finally learn what true success means." The crowd erupted with admiration. The message was clear. She didn't need vengeance anymore. She had already won. Months later, on a spring morning filled with sunlight, Isabella gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The hospital room filled with laughter and tears, as William held his grandson for the first time, his rough hands trembling with tenderness. Isabella gazed down at her child, her heart overflowing. "Welcome to the world, little one," she whispered. "You are my strength, my reason, my everything." She named him Alexander, after her mother's father, a man known for his honor. Life after Jonathan wasn't easy. There were nights of exhaustion, moments of doubt, challenges that tested her. But every time she looked into Alexander's eyes, she remembered why she had fought, why she had risen, why she had survived. Her public role grew too. She became an advocate for women, speaking at conferences, launching foundations that supported mothers abandoned by their partners. She used her platform not for revenge, but for empowerment. One evening, standing on a stage at a women's summit, Isabella shared her story. The audience listened in silence, some wiping tears, others nodding in recognition. "I thought betrayal was the end of my story," she told them, "but it was only the beginning. I thought love had broken me, but it rebuilt me. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: a woman's strength is not measured by how much pain she endures. It's measured by how she rises after the pain. And we can all rise." The crowd stood in ovation. Isabella bowed her head, not in pride, but in gratitude. Back at home, as she rocked Alexander to sleep, Isabella often thought about the journey, the humiliation, the collapse, the courtroom, the gala, the triumph. Every moment had shaped her into the woman she was now. She didn't hate Jonathan anymore. She didn't even think of Cassandra. Their names were shadows in a story that no longer belonged to them. This was her story now. Isabella Blackwell. Mother, leader, survivor, storm. And as she whispered goodnight to her son, she knew the truth that would carry her for the rest of her life. She was never broken. She was only being remade. So my dear friends, the story has now come to an end. And if you're still here with me at this very moment, it means something inside this journey has touched your heart in a way you maybe didn't expect. Perhaps it reminded you of your own struggles, your own heartbreak, or maybe it simply whispered a truth you already knew, that no betrayal, no loss, no wound has the power to define you forever. Life will test us, sometimes cruelly. People we love may betray us, promises may break, and the future we thought was certain may collapse in an instant. But as the Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Isabella's story is not just about pain, it is about rising, about discovering the fire that was always inside her, hidden beneath the ashes. And maybe tonight, as you watch, you realize the same fire lives in you. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's what healing truly is, not erasing the scars, but wearing them with dignity, as proof you survived and became stronger. So take this story with you, not as just another drama, but as a reminder. No matter who walks away, no matter how broken things seem, you are never powerless. You can rebuild, you can rise. And sometimes the ending you feared is only the beginning you needed. If this story has moved you, I'd love for you to like this video, share it with someone who needs strength today, and subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss another journey like this one. Because together, as a community, we can remind each other that pain is not the end. Sometimes it is the doorway to becoming who we were always meant to be.